I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming Jane Green, who's Professor of Politics at Nottingham College here in Oxford, and Heather Stewart, who's former political editor of The Guardian here. You can also see a picture of Stephen Bush up here, and he was planning on coming, but has had an emergency, not a serious worrying one, but a logistical one, family-wise, that meant that he sadly can't make it. It's a shame he's not here, but I think we'll get to hear more from Jane and Heather, which will be great. I'm going to kick off with some of the statistics and scene setting. Jane's going to then talk about some other aspects of the local elections and public opinion around the elections and public opinion more broadly. And then Heather is going to broaden things out for us and talk about the broader political scene. So, what do the 2024 local elections mean for the general election? I'm actually going to start, firstly, hopefully by...
Sorry.
Is this not working?
It is working in the room, but for some reason it's not on the stream, so I'm just going to put that there to pick you up, okay?
Okay,
Thank you.
great. So for anyone just joining the stream, you haven't really missed anything. I want to start actually by acknowledging that last week's elections were not just some bizarre opinion polls so that we find out what the parties are like and how they're going to perform in the next general election. We should be very grateful to all the candidates who stood and all those who got elected for giving up their time in public service. There was a real variety of different elections happening last week, not just the classic council elections. And this slide tells you the outcome in terms of seats, which is actually what matters, because it matters who governs and who's running our local authorities. And to start with, the Conservatives lost 10 councils out of the 16 they were defending, and Labour picked up most of those. The Conservatives also lost about half the seats they were defending. They had about 1,000 out of the 2,600 odd that were up for election this year. You can see from the numbers on the third row there that they were picked up fairly evenly by Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens and others. Others include residents' associations, independents and smaller parties. There were metro mayors in London and other big cities, and there were 11 of those. They're mostly won by Labour. Labour won 10 out of 11, picking up the West Midlands from the Conservatives, and Ben Hoochin in Tees Valley hung on as the only Conservative. There were 37 police and crime commissioner elections across England and Wales. The Conservatives were defending 29. They lost a third. They lost 10. They would have lost more had they not changed the electoral system from supplementary votes to first past the post. In the Greater London Assembly, the Conservatives were down to their lowest ever number of seats, down from 9 to 8. The Reform look as though they're up one, but they didn't actually have candidates last time, and UKIP had previously had one seat, so that's more like a return to the norm for the sort of Farage parties. And finally, there was a by-election in Blackpool South, which Labour won from the Conservatives on a swing of 26%, which is the third largest for a post-war post-war by-election in terms of swings between those two parties, and that was actually on par with other recent by-elections we've seen in this Parliament, and the only other times we've seen swings of that magnitude were in the run-up to Blair's victory in 1997 for Labour. So all in all, a really bad set of results for the Conservatives in terms of seats. But because this is a sort of odd set of elections, if you actually want to think about these elections and what they mean for the state of the parties, focusing on the votes in the local council elections, the BBC has for over 40 years been calculating the projected national share of the vote, which is an estimate of what the results would have been if there had been elections everywhere and if the Conservatives, Labour and Liberal Democrats had stood everywhere, which means that it is a hypothetical thing that we're estimating. There's no right answer, but the important thing is it's trying to capture some feature of party performance in a consistent way over time, so we compare shares of the vote at different elections when it's different parts of the electoral cycle for local elections, and also by focusing in on places fought by all three main parties, it mimics a general election. It focuses on those places that are a bit more like general election contests, because all three main parties are for all the constituencies throughout this period. You can see that the Conservatives there in 2024 on 25%. The last time they were on 25% was in 2013 after the omnishambles budget and the pasty tax, people might remember. And you can see a large part of that was due to UKIP, which was most of that grey, the others. The only other time they've been on 25% was in 1995, when you can see a big spike for Labour. So one of the things people have been debating since the election results is what's going on now that Tories are doing badly, but Labour are not spiking up so much as they did in the mid-90s before the Labour landslide. As I said, local elections are not just bizarre opinion polls. The local election share of the vote, the PNS, is different from the opinion polls, and you can see the opinion polls here are now in the lighter colours and the dashed lines, and you can see Labour has consistently underperformed their opinion polls in local elections. The Liberal Democrats consistently almost overperform their opinion polls, and the Conservatives are a bit more level pegging. But the crucial point about this graph is that even though local election voting and general election voting are different, the kind of performance of the parties in terms of the big changes over time, they do sort of track each other. They go up and down together. And that's the basis on which to say, actually, local elections do provide a useful indicator of what may happen at the next general election. Now, there are different ways of thinking about how to do that, how to think about the relationship between the projected national share of the vote and the future general election. One is the way that Sky and IT and Michael Thrasher have done with just projecting straight onto House of Commons seats, and they got a lot of grief over that over the weekend, so I'm not going to do that. This is an attempt to think about it in terms of how local elections in the past have indicated future results of general elections. On the x-axis, you have the Labour lead over the Conservatives in the projected national share of the vote. And on the y-axis, you have the Labour lead over the Conservatives at the next general election. There's basically two groups of elections. The numbers are each year of the local elections. And the group down the bottom are basically elections after which Labour went on to lose the next general election. And then there's just 4 points up there after which Labour went on to win. Of course, in that 40-year period, there has only been one transition from Labour in opposition to Labour in government, and that was 97. And the vertical line is what the lead in the projected national share of the vote was this year, and it was the same last year. So it's both 2023 and 24, and you can, at 9 points, that lead is higher than any other lead when they went on to lose, but it is lower than it was in 1997. So it's not as strong as 97 for Labour, but equally it is better than ever before for them. Now, that's still maybe not so comforting. One other reason while this graph is up for taking the local election share of the vote seriously, if you look in the middle there, there's 14. At the time, the 2014 local elections, we were looking at opinion polls that were suggesting a hung parliament with Labour largest party at the 2015 general election. And it turns out those polls were misleading and the Tories did a lot better and got an overall majority. One of the best forecasts at that time run by academics was Chris Prosser's forecast off the back of the projected national share of the vote, where he had a much larger Conservative seat tally. And it alerted us to the fact, in effect, that the Tories, that the polls might be biased. And I actually got in touch with him this afternoon and he re-ran the model. And it's not really good for Labour. They're only just ahead of the Labour Party on that model. But he's not pushing that as a forecast, I should hasten to say. But we should bear in mind that this outcomes of these local elections are nowhere near as strong for Labour as they might like to be achieving. Whether they like the rhetoric of, oh, it's too close to call, we need to keep focus, is another matter, and Heather might address that. Now, there are reasons to expect actually Labour to outperform what the opinion polls and do an awful lot better. And I've already somewhat exhausted my time speaking, but I still want to go through a couple more slides. And this is one of them. Basically, if you look at the current poll changes since the last election, you're looking at, on a classic uniform change projections, a Labour majority of 98. So it's pretty similar to the idea that the Conservatives and Labour are going to switch in terms of party size in the House of Commons. The Conservative vote is dropping faster than where it started stronger, and we do have these multi-level regression and post-stratification MRP projections that suggest much bigger Labour majorities in the order of 150 to 250 odd. Now, I'm not saying I think these are definitely going to be right. I think things will come down a lot from that. But these are not unreasonable estimates. On the other hand, public opinion can change a lot. In this graph, you can see just how large the error was in 2015, with the 2015 results very different from the neck-and-neck race that it looked like it was going to be just before the election. 2017 reminds us that you can get some dramatic changes in party support in an election campaign. So basically, if you took a 2015 polling error, I mean, you'd be now close to a hung parliament territory. And then if you had the kind of rise for the Tories, and if they squeezed the Reform Party, and you can see the Reform Party has gone up a lot in recent years. If the Tories squeeze the Reform Party and go up a lot during the campaign, then actually Labour's lead in the polls, which is enormous now, could disappear quite rapidly. And on that, I will actually stop speaking and hand over to Jane.
All right.
Thank you.
So it's perfect when your host overruns, because now I have carte blanche to do absolutely anything I like and talk for the next half an hour. Only kidding. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Steve for organising this. So last week I was writing something, Substack, for Sam Friedman's Substack. And the reason I was writing it was that last year, after the local elections, and also after recent by-elections, there has been a kind of tendency for many people who are commenting on the UK elections to say the following thing. And that is, well, okay, so this Brexit pattern, this Brexit realignment, and I will define that in a second, it's over. We're not talking about Brexit anymore. We're talking about the economy. We're talking about public services. And what we're seeing is essentially the unravelling of that all-important Brexit divide that happened in 2017 and 2019. Now, the reason that's an interesting kind of proposition, and the reason it's something that I want to now spend the next 10 or so minutes talking about, is that the Brexit divide has had enormous implications for British politics. I know you know that, but it's just kind of worth emphasising that we weren't in that kind of world in 2015. We were in a sort of consensual political environment, and after that we became much more polarised, and obviously the friction and the difficulties in political debate were clear for everybody to see. And there has been so much political contestation, political competition around trying to sort of shore up, especially on the right of politics, that Leave coalition. And so it's a really important question for those of us who study British elections to wonder, well, is this over? Are we kind of moving back to kind of left-right politics? Are we moving back to patterns that perhaps aren't so divisive and perhaps don't lend themselves to the same kinds of politics that we've been experiencing in recent times? So I wanted to reflect in that Substack about whether or not how we should think about this, how we should think about the results of the local elections and also local elections last year and by-elections, and whether or not this kind of pattern has dispersed. And I think that one of the point I want to make is essentially there's the potential for a kind of misinterpretation of what's going on. And I'll say why. So what do we mean by a realignment? Political scientists use this word to talk about moments in history where there's a very sharp and very dramatic, very large change in which types of voters support which parties, essentially. So the most famous example of this was in America during the Civil Rights Movement, where black voters in America had previously supported the Republicans, and now black voters historically have previously supported the Democrats. This was a fundamental shift. It was a change in the relationship of a key demographic to electoral behaviour. It happened because the parties themselves reorganised their appeals and the representation of those different groups, and it's persisted for a really long period of time. Now, after 2015, after the 2016 referendum, and then in the subsequent general elections, we have seen this very important change where now British political choice is heavily predicted by how old you are and how much educational attainment you have, whether or not you have a degree. And this is a relatively new thing. We can argue about kind of when it started and how big the change was after the Brexit referendum, but it was very significant. After the Brexit referendum. And it was particularly significant as the Conservatives moved more and more to be the party of Brexit. We're writing an entire book about realignment, so I'm just going to say that and I'm going to move on, but obviously I could say a lot more if you have questions. So that's what we mean by a realignment, and that's what we mean by the Brexit realignment. So the age and education pattern mapped onto whether people supported Leave, older voters, those with lower educational attainment, or supported Remain, younger voters, those with higher educational attainment. And this became the relationship that we saw in terms of voting for the Conservatives or the Labour Party. So have we seen the signs of the end of this Brexit realignment, and have we seen this mirrored in the local elections? So there is a view, there is evidence to suggest, well, kind of yes, because the Labour Party last week made gains in areas like Sunderland and Rochdale and Hyndburn, and these were the places in 2019 in the general election night where we were saying, wow, Labour's lost these areas of the country, the so-called red wall. And these are areas of the country that had higher proportions of working class voters, but also had high proportions of voters who were supporting Leave. They switched to the Conservatives in 2019, and the Labour Party looks like it's really making inroads into these kinds of areas. But the Labour Party is also making gains in more affluent areas of the country, and York was one of the standout examples last week. Highly affluent area dominated by those people who are more likely to have degrees. Rushmore, the council that houses Aldershot, and more affluent areas of Peterborough in Cambridgeshire. So you start to think, well, this Brexit pattern doesn't apply anymore. We also know that Conservative losses in terms of just individual votes are more comprised of Leave voters. So the phrase has been used very widely now that the Brexit coalition is fragmenting. And I was really paying really close attention to how people were interpreting the results last week. Will Jennings, who's a wonderful colleague, brilliant colleague at the University of Southampton, he works for Sky News. And he was putting some wonderful graphs up on Twitter that I was just, I just borrow everyone else's analysis because ITV, bless their hearts, don't pay for the local election results data. So we don't do ITV doesn't do a local elections programme, and I work for ITV on elections. Anyway, so we beg, borrow and steal everyone else's analysis, and it's absolutely fantastic because people are so prolific on Twitter. I'm like, thank you. Anyway, Will was showing us that there was a pattern that the Conservative to Labour swing was highest in areas of the country that voted to leave in 2016. Now, it's not a very strong correlation, to be fair, but nevertheless, it's a pattern that you can clearly see in that data. So this is all more confirmation that this kind of Brexit relationship is starting to disappear. And then my also a brilliant colleague, Rob Ford, who was working with Steve on the BBC Psephology team, did something which I just really was quite happy about, because in my Substack I'd written that, people are going to start saying, the red wall, it's been rebuilt. And so there was Rob saying, hey, this looks like a red wall. This looks like, Labour's back into the northern parts of the country, into its former heartlands, in areas of the country that voted more strongly for leave. And I don't want to make fun of this, because all of this is true, right? So it's true that the Conservatives are losing more support amongst Leavers, and it's true that their swing was higher. I'm not contesting any of that. But I do think it's misleading for the relationship of Brexit to how people have voted. And I think what we saw last week was very much the following, which is that the Conservatives are losing support pretty much across the board. They're losing support amongst Leavers, they're losing support amongst Remainers, they're losing support in Leave areas of the country, they're losing support in Remain areas of the country. Now, what that then starts to look like is that this doesn't matter anymore. And that's because the Labour Party is essentially just making gains everywhere. Not as Steve said, not as strongly as they might wish to have done, and that's partly because local elections are different to general elections. We tend to vote for minor parties, independents, more in local elections. But I do think there's a kind of misleading inference that this Brexit relationship doesn't apply anymore. So I use this phrase, tides versus tribes, right? So if you think about kind of the expression like a rising tide lifts all boats, or we can flip that down and say, okay, a lowering tide lowers all boats. If you're a Brexiteer or if you're a Remainer, everybody's less likely now to support the Conservative Party. The tide has gone out for the Conservatives. But the relationship, the tribes, are still a really important part of understanding what's going on in British electoral behaviour. So Labour will gain seats in Leave areas if it makes gains uniformly. If the tide rises, it's going to win back the red wall just by being more popular overall, for no reason at all to do with Brexit. It's also Labour's going to do better in Remain areas as well compared to 2019, because Labour's vote share was really very, very low in 2019. And the Conservative vote was so heavily Leave in 2019 that essentially they have to lose more Leavers overall. So if you think again about that tide, we think about the proportion of people voting Conservative in 2019 who would have voted to stay out of the EU. It's about 81% of Conservatives in 2019 were Leavers. Almost like the implication of this Brexit divide is that the Conservative, if they lose anyone, they have to be losing loads of Leave voters. Now, does that mean that these tribes don't exist anymore? Or does it mean that everyone's kind of just moving away from the Tories and the tribes are still in place? So I'm going to argue the latter. And it's a really, I think one of the things you'd expect too, wouldn't you, that the Conservatives would be doing slightly worse in areas where they'd done slightly better last time, if this is true. You'd also expect the swing to have been slightly greater in areas of the country that voted more heavily for Leave if their vote was so predominantly comprised of Leave voters. It just has to be true. It's one of those weird things. So the tide has gone out for the Tories so far. The tribes could still remain. And now here's a graph that just looks at 2019 Conservative voters and whether or not they continue to support the Conservative Party in their vote intention in subsequent waves of the British Election Study Internet Panel. So this is following the 2019 voters from January 2020 all the way through to May 2023 last year. And what you see there, the blue is the Leave voters, those people who would vote to stay out in another referendum, and the yellow is those who would rejoin. So we obviously had to switch the wording of that question. And essentially, the story here is that the pattern has shifted similarly for everybody. But what's also true is that even though the Conservative Party has lost a lot of its leavers, so most of those people who are leaving have to be leavers, right, because it was so high in the first instance, but the proportion's basically the same. So the proportion of the Conservative vote today, or at least as of last year, when we last were in the field, we're in the field right now, but obviously we don't have data yet. But last year, when we last collected data, the proportion of people who are voting, who still intended to vote Conservative, were predominantly still as Levy, as was true in 2019. There's just fewer Leavers and there's fewer Conservatives. So that tribe is still a consistent pattern. And you can see it for Labour and the Tories here. This is just another way of representing that graph, but in a different way for Labour and the Tories. The bold line represents the proportion of people who intend to vote for the Conservatives who would also vote, who are also on the Leave side of the debate. And that's when you're using their updated, like yes, they would still vote to stay out. The dotted line is if you use 2016 referendum choice, and that looks slightly weaker. That's because there's been so much opinion change and so much kind of reorganisation of people's vote on the basis of Leave and Remain. And for the Labour Party is still the party of Remain. The Conservatives are still the party of Leave. It's just the denominators have changed. The size of these groups have changed. There's now more people who would support Remain. There's now more people who would vote for the Labour Party. And the reverse is true for the Conservative Party. So what I think was going on last week was more evidence of this. And what's fascinating on local elections programs is that everybody's focusing on the details, on the places, on the kind of, idiosyncrasies of, what's happening in Rochdale or what's happening in Plymouth or what's happening in so far. And it's really difficult. It's really difficult when you're doing an election program until you've got the data and you can look at the kind of statistical relationships to see the wood for the trees. And so I think the wood for the trees is the Brexit tribes is still a really important way to understand British electoral behaviour. But the tide is such that a lot of this is now hidden under the surface. So Labour's support is going to go up in those Leave and Remain areas. It's going to look like Brexit doesn't matter anymore. But beneath the surface, we're still a country that's fundamentally divided by this Leave and Remain divide. The fascinating thing is we're not actually talking about it anymore. And the parties aren't talking about it anymore. But that pattern is very persistent, and that's because of what we understand about realignments. So I hope that's clear. I hope that gives us a different take on the local elections, and I'll hand over to Heather. Thank you.
Hi, thank you ever so much for inviting me. And as you can see, I've got no slides, and I should warn you that when I studied PPE here more years ago than I'm not going to mention a number, occasionally my tutors used to write journalistic in the margin, so just think broad brush and impressionistic rather than all those fabulous charts. I wanted to start with a couple of reasons why, and this is partly to justify the points I'm going to make afterwards, which are kind of jumping over a general election to think about some of the pressures Labour is going to face should it form the next government. But there were a couple of reasons why Steve's sort of counterfactual, which is the polls could narrow, we could still end up with a very narrow result. That could happen. But there are sort of political reasons, I think, why it's hard to imagine. And one is just the fact that we're looking at an administration that's been in power for 14 years, albeit with a number of different prime ministers. Labour is doing very well at hammering home that message. I don't know if you've seen these sort of silly spoof documentaries they've got at the moment called Conflicts, they're calling it, but they're just reminding people that, this is the party that gave you Boris Johnson, that gave you Liz Truss, that gave you Theresa May, remember her. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the Conservatives to construct a narrative at this point that changes that. You add into that the point that the fact that public services are crumbling, which the polls tell you is what a lot of people want to talk about, and I suspect that's one of the reasons that those Brexit identities, while still important, are not being talked about so much, because the salience of it as an issue is lower, because other issues are much higher up the list, including the absolute state of public services and also the sort of cost of living crisis. And I would also say one of the things that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt were hoping for, counting on, was a sort of switch in the economic mood and the vibe and the sort of feel-good factor. If you looked at the start of the year, we were expecting a whole bunch of interest rate cuts, about 6, I think we were looking at that point. I mean, we'll be lucky to get one now, and it seems unlikely that that's suddenly going to create this mood that'll make everyone grateful towards the Conservatives. And one more point is the campaigning one. And Steve talked about the 2017 campaign, which is one that I covered, and so I remember very vividly. And that was really unusual. I can remember being taught that campaigns don't really matter. Election campaigns don't really matter much as political journalists love them. They don't really make any difference to the results. You sort of, if you're a psephologist, switch off. And that was a rare campaign which really did matter. And if you remember Theresa May being incredibly kind of robotic, and they went for a really punchy policy on funding dementia care, which turned out to be not super popular. And and meanwhile Jeremy Corbyn was going around the country with these great rallies and standing at Glastonbury, and everybody was singing, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," and it was a kind of really strange sort of political moment where the campaign changed things. Well, Rishi Sunak, not a great campaigner, I would say. Looked a great campaigner when he was in number 10 and he could stand behind a podium, and he literally wasn't allowed to meet any members of the public during COVID, and he was handing out enormous cheques and saving lots of people's jobs. I think any example of when you see him out and about with the public, incredibly awkward. So he could surprise us all and run an amazing campaign that turns things around. I think it's quite unlikely. So with those excuses in mind for why my thoughts on Friday when I was looking at the results coming in and through the weekend was to start, and maybe that's because I sort of covered Labour a lot, was to think about the pressures, the dynamic that will be in play once Labour, if and when Labour gets into power, and what the results tell us about that. And there were a few points on that, I thought. One was these increasingly important metro mayoralties, which, they have different levels of powers, some more than others, and there's a sort of patchwork of them that it's a sort of process of devolution. But Labour's now, I think Labour's got 10 now. Ben Houchen was about the only one in the Tees Valley who remained for the Conservatives. These are really big national Labour figures. They're going to form part of the debate. They have a platform. They already have a record of taking a slightly different view on issues to the national Labour leadership. So, you hear Sadiq Khan talking about rent controls, for example. You hear Andy Burnham talking about suspending right to buy, which is not Labour's policy. If Keir Starmer's a Labour Prime Minister, he's going to have to sort of find a way of dealing with and he doesn't give them a great deal of prominence. You don't see them up on the stage at Labour Party conference giving speeches. You don't, whereas Andy Street was always feted at Conservative Party conference. I'm not sure Labour knows quite what to do with these figures, and they're potentially going to be quite important, and they'll be able to band together once Labour's in government and say, hey, look, over here we need this, and it will be hard for Labour to ignore that, I think. I think there weren't elections happening in Scotland, local elections happening in Scotland, but the row over the projection, the national projection that Steve talked about, which was quite controversial, which Sky did, which pointed to a hung parliament, reminded us how important Scotland was, right? Because Scotland and the Labour's hopes in Scotland is one of the reasons why Labour thinks it can get a majority. It thinks it can advance hugely in Scotland, given the SNP's implosion, I want to say, or certainly their issues and their travails. So, Scottish politics was played quite importantly in the run-up to the general election, and the demands of Scottish politics, which can be slightly different, will play into Labour's national narrative. So, for example, if you talk to Angela Rayner's people about their agenda on workers' rights, they say that plays really strongly in Scotland, and that will be very important, and that's one of the reasons we can't sort of ditch that agenda. And you also saw Scottish leader Anas Sarwar, for example, didn't listen when Keir Starmer was telling his front benchers, please don't go and stand on picket lines with trade unions, it's really not a good look. He's got a slightly different stance, and if you've got a lot of Scottish politicians, Scottish Labour politicians coming into Westminster, again, that's a way in which the sort of national debate changes, potentially. The strength of the Greens was really interesting. And I think the psephologists will mainly tell you that you'd expect a lot of those votes to the Greens to fall in behind Labour at a general election. Labour as the sort of progressive party. Obviously not all of them, there'll be people who want to vote Green nevertheless, but there's likely to be quite a lot of tactical voting in a general election, and you might expect the Greens perhaps to fall behind Labour. But then there'll be a sense that Green voters, Green supporters have lent their vote to Labour, and that again creates pressure for Keir Starmer to sort of fulfil some of those expectations. And, he dropped that £28 billion policy recently, as we know. Thinking about 2-3 years into a parliament, there's a pressure on him that, some of these voters may have supported you because you're a progressive party and they didn't think a Green candidate was going to get in where they stood. But, that's creating a demand for something that Labour may not feel able to give. I mean, I should say there's one seat where the Greens hope to make a gain, the new Bristol Central constituency, which is currently Bristol West, but Thangham Debonair's constituency. They really, they think they can make a gain there. But again, I think environmental issues inevitably are going to be increasingly part of national conversation, but I think that will shape the way that Labour responds to them to some extent. And we also saw in some areas with strong Muslim populations, some sense that Labour was being punished for its stance on Gaza. In the West Midlands, not that it stopped Labour winning the West Midlands mayoralty, it's quite hard to say that, but Ahmed Yaqub, the sort of George Galloway party candidate, got 69,000 votes. Again, Labour will hope to win some of those people back in a general election, but it sort of will underline for them the importance or the sort of potentially problematic nature of foreign policy. And brackets, we all remember Iraq. And I think Keir Starmer, when he was initially setting out Labour's policy on Gaza, was thinking, I'm going to be a world leader, I'm going to be a statesman, I need to be thinking about what I'm going to say to other world leaders. Well, this is a reminder he also needs to think about different constituencies in Labour's sort of voter base and how they feel about things, and that also will shape their thinking, I think. And also, and this is a point that our mutual friend Rob Ford made to me when I was talking to him recently about something completely different. It was about Labour's Brexit policy. But it also reminded us the gains that Labour was making, which aren't just in those ex-Red Wall areas, but they're in Rushmore, in York, in sort of different areas which have a very different makeup. Well, that's going to really change the conversation, the political debate, I think. And you sort of, it really, which seats are the marginal ones? So which seats the governing party really, really wants to hold on to, the ones it needs to hold on to maintain its majority. Those tend to be the ones whose MPs are able to kind of exact concessions from the leadership, are able to sort of shape debate. And we've seen that in the sort of 2019 Parliament. You've got all those MPs who came in promising to get Brexit done, in those ex-Labour seats promising levelling up. Who have a really, they're all quite right-wing anyway, they had to sign up to the idea of a no-deal Brexit, but they also believe very strongly that the Tories need to be very tough on migration, and that's what sort of has really shaped the debate to quite, and it's partly what's made the Tory party quite ungovernable, but it's also really shaped the debate. If Labour, if Jane's tide advances far enough, that Labour is winning a bunch of seats across the south and in different kinds of areas, in affluent areas, it's really going to change the nature of the debate. And instead of political journalists jumping in the car and going up to interview people in the market in Dudley or in Stoke, or it's going to give a very, very different flavour to things. And you might find, if the sort of economic crisis subsides a bit, we pull out of recession, things aren't quite so tricky on that front, you might find that the Remainer tribe start to make themselves heard a little bit more. And a lot of those people, despite the fact that Keir Starmer never mentions Brexit, or rarely mentions Brexit, except to say it doesn't work totally well and we'll make it work better, there will be a lot of people who will have voted for him, remembering he's that guy. I can remember listening to that speech at Labour conference where he was saying, we've got to have a referendum, we've got to have Remain or go re-enter, rejoin on the ballot paper. He won the Labour leadership on that basis. There'll be lots of voters who will have that he'll still think he's that guy and will still expect him. And at the moment, Labour's perception of the debate on a lot of these things, I was talking to people in Labour the other day, because as I say, I was writing a piece about their Brexit policy, and I was talking about migration, and I was saying, what about a youth mobility scheme, this thing the EU's offered, where young people could go and spend 2 years in the EU, we could take some young people from the EU and they could come here. We have a similar thing with Australia, New Zealand already, and they just really, this sort of shadow front bencher that was talking to really kind of recoiled and said, migration's completely politically toxic, we can't have that, we couldn't allow it, it's not what people want. Well, I don't know. I think if you're looking at a different bunch of seats and a different bunch of voters and your constituency is a bit different, maybe it's not quite so toxic as it might seem to Labour sitting in the position it's in now. So I think that will be really interesting and it's difficult to know how they navigate through that, and at the moment they have a strong belief they have to be super, super cautious on Brexit because those tribes still exist and they don't want to alienate the Leave tribe who are important to some of the seats they want to win. But I think those tensions are going to play out probably quite interestingly. And I think, just to sort of end, I think there's a lot of this plays into the sort of general framing of the next Parliament, potentially, assuming that we don't get that narrowing of polls that we saw in 2017, in which case, and 2015, in which case all bets are off and, it'll be chaos. But like, I covered that 2017 to 2019 Parliament, and it was a sort of rolling nervous breakdown on all sides, all political sides. But assuming that doesn't happen, and assuming that we get a Labour majority, the framing, I think, is going to be that, you've got a country that has been underinvested in for a really long period. Almost every expert agrees with that. Public services crumbling, productivity incredibly weak because business investment is low as well as public investment. Huge demands on this government, and a Labour Party that's committed itself incredibly strongly to fiscal discipline because that's what it, somewhat to some extent that's what it believes in. If you're Rachel Reeves, but also it believes that's what you need to say to get elected. And meanwhile, you've got Green voters supporting you, you've got Remain voters supporting you, who'd like to see a different relationship with your closest trading partner. There's a lot of, there's a lot to be won and there's a lot of change to be achieved, but I also think that sort of tension is going to run right through any future Labour government, and it's going to be really, really interesting to watch it play out, I think.
Going in to rescue the mic. There should be a roving mic somewhere for people to ask questions so that they can be heard online. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah, there's one there. Can you wait for the mic? It's Marion, isn't it?
Yes.
Right.
Hello, my name is Mehreen Khan. I guess I'm here because I'm one of Steve's former students, and I'm also a journalist. So I'm gonna make some politically unscientific comments. But I wanted to get to Jane's point and thinking about the eye test when it comes to this tribalism on Brexit. And I agree that it still exists, but we also have to point out that this sort of weird realignment is not something that is unique to Britain and Brexit. We're seeing it in lots of European or developed world economies. In Germany, in Italy, in the US, perhaps what we could crudely call the culture wars take over and they collapse the traditional left and right, the centre collapses, and therefore politics becomes much more unpredictable. And maybe Brexit was the catalyst for that realignment in the UK, but this is not something particularly special to us. So I wanted to ask about the salience of this tribe, and given that actually talking about the single market, the customs union, the relationship with the EU is not very salient anymore, can we use these tribes as proxies for something else? So is the average Leave voter more likely to be anti-migration, skeptical about climate change, have particular views about how economic policy should run? So can we use the tribal sort of identities and sort of translate them onto other political issues? And I'm an economics journalist, so I would love to say that we are going to have an election about economic policy. But I'm actually quite disheartened about when I think about the public discourse, because everything is becoming a culture war issue. So the distributional issues around climate change, technically an economic type of issue, is much more a culture war sort of issue. It's about the costs versus the benefits. It's about whether you live in a city and whether you've got an EV and you can afford charging. It's about ULEZ, all these sort of stuff. So migration, which is classically could be an economic issue, is also forming into a much more identitarian issue. So in some senses, I sort of share Jane's view that Brexit is still there, but do we develop this identity into something else, which is bigger than just our relationship with the EU? Does it tell us something else about the cleavages within the UK? And just foreign policy. One of the reasons the US is having a realignment potentially generationally is between the vast discrepancy between how voters under the age of 40 think about Biden's policy on Israel compared to those over the age of 40. I don't think it's politically always very sexy to think that foreign policy has an impact on domestic elections in the UK. Is that actually something that might change with this election, given the salience of this issue and the fact that it's probably not going to go away?
Thanks so much. I said that when I was in my remarks that we're writing a book about the realignment. And so there's a couple of points that I think speak to this, to your analysis. You're absolutely right to say that there is a trend that's shared across countries. And one of the reasons I think the British case is so interesting and important to understand is that within our electoral system, it took
it took party competition. It took the two major political parties to make that second dimension, the salient dimension of political competition, for this to be a really dynamic, important force shaping electoral behaviour. And so one of the things that we point to is just how important political actors are to the salience of these kinds of issues. Now, of course, Brexit, there's a contingency through all of that, right? Why did we have a referendum? Why did David Cameron resign? Blah, 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 blah. But essentially what's really important to understand here is that this isn't something that's just kind of happening. And I think a lot of the analysis that looks cross-nationally almost says, well, people are just very concerned about immigration, they're very concerned about nationalism, and it's almost just there and politicians are responding to it. But I don't think that's correct. I think what's happening is actually attitudes are becoming more progressive overall, but the political competition around that issue is increasing the electoral salience, the electoral potency of those issues. Now, why that's also important, thinking about your analysis of, everything's culture wars now, can we ever go back to a time, is it kind of almost naive to think we can go back to a time where we're talking about bread and butter politics and, economics, is that the parties themselves have different incentives. And a lot of the salience, the relevance of these issues is conditional on what they do. So the Conservatives have spent the last couple of years trying essentially new ways of getting their 2019 coalition back. Now, the problem with that is that their 2019 coalition was founded on Jeremy Corbyn being leader of the Labour Party. It was founded on Brexit being an tractable problem. It was founded on Boris Johnson having a certain appeal and not yet having fallen from grace. So they don't have that same ability to do that, but they have been, of course, trying to find different ways to do it. And, one of the other important parts of our argument is that the reason this persists is that people still see the two largest parties are representing those two sides of the debate, right? Essentially, the political competition hasn't really fundamentally changed. It's just different. It's being proxied. It's being demonstrated or amplified in different ways. So, but the last point is the flip side of that is that Labour don't have an incentive to do that. And Labour is likely to come into power. And Labour is likely, if Heather's, I think I share your view about the campaign as well. Are we going to see a campaign where Rishi Sunak suddenly, sets the public debate and leads the agenda setting, or is it going to be Keir Starmer? And I think, the Labour Party really have an incentive to talk about the economy and to talk about public services and to talk about, how people are feeling after these, 4 very difficult years. So, rambling around that is, I just don't think this is just a given. I think it's very much a product of politics, and I think the Labour Party, at the least, have an incentive not to play this culture war game. The Conservatives, however, do, but I think it will backfire. I don't think they're going to win a large enough coalition again using that same strategy. Do you want to take the foreign politics question?
I don't know how much of an impact it's going to have now. I think it's true, but I do think it's true that it's an age divide thing, which is a really interesting thing. I think Iraq probably the very, very, very long tail of Iraq and tells you that foreign policy absolutely can have an impact on general elections. I think I think that's probably right. And I think it also arguably laid the groundwork for Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party. What I don't know is what we can say about what impact the Gaza issue might have, but I think it is one of those moments that change the way that people think about the world, and particularly, as you say, people under 40. And I don't know to what extent that's going to shape their voting intention, but it's I don't think we can rule out it having an impact. I don't know. What do you think about foreign policy?
I'll just add a couple of things. So 2005 is instructive on this. So 2 important things. You've already mentioned sort of Muslim vote and the pattern of the Muslim areas in the last local elections swinging much more away from Labour. And in 2005, we saw Muslim areas swinging to the Liberal Democrats because of opposition to the then Labour government's participation in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it made Oxford East a marginal constituency. but it seems to me less likely this time to make constituencies that Labour currently hold more marginal. It's much, especially given the tide is generally to Labour, it's probably going to just mean that the Labour MPs in Muslim areas, and Muslim areas are typically Labour seats, Labour's just going to win with a smaller majority than they might otherwise have done. But the other thing about 2005 is that, for most voters, the issue ended up being whether you trust Tony Blair or not. And most Labour voters in 2005 were just as against the Iraq War by 2005 as were Liberal Democrat voters in 2005. The difference between them was that the Labour voters were the only ones who still trusted Tony Blair enough to carry on voting for Labour. And so it does become a question of, do you still trust Keir Starmer and Keir Starmer's instincts? And going back to what you were saying about campaigning, there's a question about Rishi Sunak, but there's also a question about whether voters warm to Keir Starmer and whether they kind of see him as somebody that they instinctively trust to lead them and be their Prime Minister. And actually, having said that, you've met him. Do you want to comment?
I mean, he's not charismatic, lively, exciting, bloke you'd want to go for a drink in the pub with, unless you're particularly an Arsenal fan and want to watch the football with him, which I'm not. But I'm not sure. One of my colleagues, Raf Bear, wrote a column along these lines with much cleverer thoughts than I have in it this morning, but I'm not sure that's necessarily what voters want at this point in the electoral cycle after 14 years of kind of chaos. I think maybe being the kind of straight down the middle guys is maybe what people feel strongly about. However, if Gaza for you is a really foundational issue, you're going to remember him. You're going to remember that moment where he, appeared to say it was fine for Israel to be cutting off the waters, but which Labour would say that was not what he meant. But these things can have cast a sort of long shadow, I think. But I think he's well-intentioned, trustworthy, honest. Lots of things that it would be impossible to say about, for example, Boris Johnson. Mm-hmm. So and he's not in the Theresa May category of sort of so odd that it's hard to conduct a conversation. So, I think it's unlikely. He could completely implode on the campaign trail, but I think it's quite unlikely. He's quite a sort of held, controlled person, and which if you were standing him against someone who was super razzmatazz at maybe a different point in the economic cycle when people weren't reaching for sort of safety and stability, that might be different. But I think he's probably not a bad candidate to be standing in a moment like this.
Thank you. Another question. There's one in the back in the middle, and then there's one there.
Thank you. Working? Hi, I'm Colin Ross-Smith, member of the public.
Sorry.
Colin Ross-Smith, member of the public.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could address the so-called populist issue. On the continent, you'd be talking about populism now. I mean, yesterday Francesca Giffey claims to have been attacked in a library in Berlin by somebody or other, and they're all up in arms about, the populist rise of the AfD and so on. In Belgium and France and Italy, it's all over the news. But I don't think anyone mentioned it at all today. Maybe I missed it. Maybe it might have been one word. Could you say how that comes into all this, or is it just that Britain isn't affected by whatever populism might be? Popular democracy that you can't control because it's revolutionary. Could you address that?
Yeah. There are two, maybe three things I think are important for context. One is the huge amount of disenchantment and disillusionment and fed-upness that I think exists in the electorate at the moment. And you're seeing that in the local elections. You're seeing, we saw the Greens vote up in areas where Labour's, was unmovable. So more tactical voting, essentially, more anti-conservative voting. Now, that's a very toxic context. It's a very difficult context, and it's a context in which populism thrives. So there's a slight concern that I have, I guess, about Keir Starmer, that, in a way it sort of would be better, I think, if he were more personally appealing and more able to cut through and a little bit more kind of liked, because one of the problems we've got is that none of the leaders are really liked, none of the leaders are particularly trusted. So that's a very that's a very toxic, in my opinion, context for any election to be held. The second point of thinking about kind of the threat or the challenge, or how much we think of populism having a force in our upcoming election. I guess the place to look there is to the Reform UK supporters, and then again it's kind of important to understand that this kind of bifurcation, this kind of polarisation, I don't like the word polarisation very much, but this kind of divided leave remain kind of sides of the electorate, what we're seeing there is a splintering of the Conservative right towards Reform UK, and that's why the Conservatives are losing support, and that's why they're panicking. And they're panicking in a context where they are looking to try to restore the voters that are moving off to Reform UK, and they are potentially obviously going to have a huge, well, it doesn't take me to tell you that they're going to have a huge debate within themselves if and when they lose, about whether or not they double down on that and become, in effect, a much more populist leaning party. So I had 3 points. I can't remember what my third one was. I'm sure it's great. Maybe I'll think about it in a minute.
I mean, I would just say we haven't mentioned Nigel Farage, who we don't know what role he might play in a campaign, whether he might, but he is a populist figure, and we don't know how that might transform the campaign. I think it's absolutely right, totally unscientific, but as someone who goes around the country and asks, has to sort of stop people on the street and ask them what they think about politics, that sense of kind of, God, they're all as bad as each other. You get this kind of, I hate all of them. And I think if somebody who comes along and is capable of sort of voicing that, and in different ways, I think Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 was a kind of, I'm not a career politician, I'm not like these other guys, I'll represent you against the establishment. Boris Johnson, weirdly, brackets Eton, Oxford, somehow had aspects of, I'm going to strike these. They want to stop me, but I'm your guy. I represent you. So I think there were aspects of populism which we managed to sort of channel into our existing party framework. You ain't going to be able to do that when your leaders are Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. So I do have a worry about that, and I wonder whether it's Nigel Farage or whether it's somebody else, and whether it happens now or whether it happens at some point through the next Parliament. I think that's interesting, and I don't think we should rule it out as a concern, as a worry. There was another one, wasn't there?
There was another question here.
You need to keep your hand up.
Do you want to put your hand up again?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a student here and a Labour Party activist. So firstly, very quickly, I just wanted to ask, when do you think Sunak will call the election? Will he go early, or will he wait till the last possible minute for something to turn up? And then, with this rising tide that could potentially carry Labour into government, does that have any longevity once they're actually in government, or is it something that could kind of fade away quite quickly and lead to just a one-term Labour government? And what are the factors that might make a difference to that? Thank you.
I'll actually answer those two questions or give my view on those two questions quickly first. So I don't know when the election's going to be, but I'm most persuaded by arguments it's going to be the 24th of October, 14th of November, or 21st of November, just because they're going to want to push it as late as reasonable, and January is not going to be reasonable because it's just going to be too horrific. And on balance, given the way the polls are, given the reasons why Labour are likely to overperform the uniform swing projections, given the distribution of the votes that Jane was talking about, given the tactical voting that we're expecting, given the squeeze on the minor parties that we can reasonably expect based on the last 2-3 general elections, we are looking at two-term Labour government at least. The slides I skipped over actually basically saying that in the long scheme of things, if you look at elections since 1922, governments tend to win elections unless there's a recession or some kind of economic crisis, in which case they tend to lose. And on that basis, if Labour can manage to avoid a recession, they could stay in for quite a long time.
That's really interesting. I don't know whether it's the sort of natural pessimist in me as a sort of left of centre person, but I'm all about, gosh, what are the missteps that Labour could make? What are the groups that they will have to bring with them and keep with them? What are the risks? Although, if the alternative is a Conservative government, and if, as we expect, the Conservatives go on a little journey into the wilderness, and parties that are defeated after a long period in government, it doesn't tend to go well, does it? You can see the blame game starting already. So I guess it's not just how do Labour perform and do they meet the expectations of the different groups that are voting for them. It's also how are the other guys getting on and what are the alternatives. And if it's Suella Braverman, maybe I should be more optimistic and not so worried about a single term phenomenon. What do you think, Jane?
So I think Labour needs to be really worried about only having one term. And the reason is that, and lots of people are saying this, that there aren't very many pull factors. They're just push factors away from the Conservative Party. Now, what we know is if you lend your support to a party and you don't particularly like that party, you don't particularly identify with that party, then you're the voter that's going to move away the soonest. So what it looks like is that a lot of people will vote Labour in the general election, but won't really like the Labour Party very much, and that isn't a very strong electoral coalition, essentially. So the reason the Conservatives have lost support is because they've messed up on their performance, like people's confidence in them has gone. It's not because they've sort of ideologically pulled in one direction or another direction, or moved away from one kind of voter or another kind of voter. That's kind of the point of the tides versus tribes thing. So what's happened is that this has been a kind of loss of confidence, loss of competence for the party. That isn't enough, I think, to make people feel really tied to the Labour Party. Timing, I'm going for December the 12th.
Political journalists will hate that. 2019 was a December election, and it was really how to upset the entire political journalism corps. Not only that, but then they recalled Parliament in between the election and Christmas to get whatever Brexit nonsense it was through Parliament. So I think the journalists will be saying, please not December, but yeah, maybe you're right. But not early, I think. I think there was some thought that it could be early, and I think if you were Prime Minister who looked at those local election results and decided to go in July, we'd have to question his sanity, I think. So, yeah, you'd say autumn at the earliest.
Any more questions? There's two in the middle there. So, Alison and then Andrew. Yeah.
Alison, Andrew, I teach economics here. I was wondering, given what you said about the salience of the collapse of public services, how do we square that with sort of Labour's extreme cautiousness on tax and spending, kind of how little they've been willing to commit? And to what extent is that motivated by kind of looking inward within the Labour Party, wanting to distinguish, Keir Starmer wanting to distinguish himself from Jeremy Corbyn, as opposed to kind of looking outward at the Tory party?
I mean, I don't know how you reconcile it, and that's one of my worries about whether you get a one-term Labour government or a two-term Labour government, or whether there's some point 2 years in where it all falls apart. And I find it very difficult to square, because it feels like there's, if you look at the polling, it tells you that the salience of public service is very high. If you go out and talk to people on the street, then they're less likely to be, this is very unscientific. I know you're not a fan of Vox Pop, Steve, but they tend to be not talking to you about stopping the boats. They tend to be talking to you about the fact they can't get a GP's appointment. And, if you talk to candidates who've been out knocking on doors, people are saying, my wife, daughter, cousin was waiting in A&E for 12 hours and whatever. So I really struggle to reconcile it, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't think that their tight fiscal position, I don't think it's to do with internal, I don't think it's to do with not being backing Jeremy Corbyn. I think it's more to do with what Labour strategists think you need to do to win an election. And in a way, I think there's a bit of kind of fighting the last war, being very scarred by George Osborne saying you didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining and all of that sort of stuff. It's a sort of conversation about tax and spending that Jeremy Corbyn tried to break out of, and Labour have absolutely battened down the hatches and gone back into a conversation in it. You know, it feels like 2010 or something, but I don't think the state of the country is 2010, so it worries me.
Do you want to add anything, Jane?
Only that if I were in the Labour Party, I would be saying learn the lessons that George Osborne taught you, which is use your incumbency to blame the people before you, because it's that strategy that was really effective between 2010 and 2015. So I don't think they need to be purely defensive in that sense. Obviously they are. Obviously they're very worried about their credibility. But that's the lesson I would have taken if I were them.
So if I remember rightly, you're talking about maxing out the nation's credit card and and spending over your limit.
Labour started to say that about the Tories, though. That's
okay.
Labour started to use that exact phrase about the Tories. So it's like a rerun.
Yeah. Andrew.
Hi, thanks. Andrew Greenway, another one of Steve's former students. There's quite a few of us in here, I suspect. I wanted to ask about turnout, which I don't think we've touched on too much. So I was wondering if we can draw any conclusions at all from the turnout figures, from the locals to the nationals, what you would expect to see, given the kind of some of the context you've already touched on in terms of the sort of the lack of excitement perhaps for the two major parties, and what turnout you think Labour or the Conservatives would prefer.
I'll say something a little bit about turnout last week. So for me, in my most geeky phase, the most interesting thing I thought was that Wales had Police and Crime Commissioner only elections and not council elections, and there the turnout was super low, about 15%. It was highest in London, Greater London Assembly and London Mayor elections than basically any other category of elections. Most of the rest are in between, with the council elections about 30%. The mayoral elections, even though we've been talking a lot about how prominent these mayors are, Ben Hoochin, Andy Street, Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham. Actually, a lot of those elections had turnout between 25 and 32%. It wasn't actually spectacularly high. And there isn't much read across, I think, from local election turnout to general election turnout. Basically, it's about mobilising another group of people. It is one thing that reminds us about caution about extrapolating from local elections. Basically, if you've only got about a third of people voting in the local elections, the other sort of third plus of people that turn out in addition in a general election are different kinds of people, and so your average general election and the people that swing general elections are different. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I'm going to typically make a very unscientific comment, which is that I think it's absolutely true that there's may not be a great enthusiasm for Labour or great love for Keir Starmer. I think getting the Tories out is going to be a really, really strong pull factor. It's not going to be let's put Keir Starmer in number 10, but it's going to be let's get these guys out. And I think it feels to me like there's a real kind of mood, even when you listen to sort of comedy programmes or sort of popular culture is telling you the country's fed up with the Tories and wants them to go. And I feel like it will be one of these turning point elections, and so I feel like the turnout might, even though people are disenchanted with politics, I think there's a sort of strong impetus to sort of chuck this lot out, and that actually, I don't know, we'll see, but that might be quite a strong motivating factor, seems to me.
Thank you. So your question, I think, is also like which party benefits from high or low turnout. And this is one of these questions every single election we wonder about, differential turnout effects. So what we have to remember now is that age predicts whether you're going to be likely to vote, and it predicts which party you're going to support. So there's the potential then that Conservative voters are more likely to turn out. because they're older. The kind of caveat to that is I actually wonder if, and therefore high turnout would, or maybe low turnout, in fact, would benefit the Tories. The caveat to that is I think both parties have a problem with turnout now, both of the two largest parties. So I think Labour has a problem with, and this is where we could get a bit of a polling snafu, is Labour has a problem with younger voters who say they're going to vote Labour, who say they're going to vote, and are less likely to actually follow through. And the Conservatives have a problem with a lot of their older voters are really fed up with them and disillusioned and are just very undecided about who to vote for, especially the female older Conservative voters. So this then makes me think, well, I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be a differential turnout effect. The other thing to keep a really close eye on is voter ID. So voter ID was a problem last week, anecdotally, but of course it's going to be a problem. And if you look at the kinds of people that don't have voter ID, it's also the young and the old. It's not the middle group, right? It's those people who, haven't yet got a passport or haven't yet got their kind of ID. And then it's older people who don't need a passport anymore or don't need those forms of ID. And there's loads of remedies. You can get all these different kinds of, blue badge type related ones and all the rest of it. But, getting hold of it on time, remembering it, it's a massive issue. And it's going to be a bigger issue in the general election. So that will be the first time that voter ID has been tested amongst voters who are less likely to have got organised to know how to cast their ballot. So again, that could actually essentially balance out for the two parties. So I don't know, but I think those are the key things that we're going to need to find out.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much all for coming on such a lovely sunny evening, and thank you very much from a wonderful panellists. Thank you.